Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Discover why many of the world's largest organizations innovate securely with Invicti. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. ThreatLocker is a global cybersecurity leader paving the way for businesses everywhere to implement a zero-trust security solution that not only protects business-critical data, but also helps mitigate cyber attacks. ThreatLocker's unique endpoint solutions help you to work smart and strengthen your security infrastructure from the ground up. ThreatLocker's allow listing, ring fencing, storage control, elevation control, and network access control solutions give you a more secure approach to blocking the exploits of unknown application vulnerabilities. If you're looking to enhance your cybersecurity and stop zero-day vulnerabilities exploiting your data, reach out to a ThreatLocker cyber hero today. Visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker to learn more. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Manish Gupta from Shift Left about the importance of fix rates as a metric for AppSec and DevOps teams to come together for software success. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and it's just about time for the news. But first, don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content like us. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to any of your podcast feeds or our podcast feeds, since we're the ones doing them right now, and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list and Discord server and follow us on our social media and our streaming platforms. Although we'd love to hear what platforms you have and what podcasts you're listening to. Come talk to us, give us feedback. Because we'd also love your feedback if you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows. Submit your suggestions at securityweekly.com/guests. We review those suggestions monthly, and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. As I finished stumbling through the intro, John, I was distracted. Been watching all kinds of old school music videos, Ultravox from Eurythmics, some Phil Collins. So I was have to admit I got to pay attention, but we got to pay attention because there's some fun news this week. One of them is just a simple vulnerability, cross-site scripting, that normally I kind of ignore cross-site scripting. And that's just a little bit of a personal bias because it's been around for a little bit more than the 5 to 10 years of AppSec that Manish mentioned in the last segment. It's at least 20, possibly even 30 years if we talk about just generic HTML injection as well. But it's still worth highlighting because it happens. In this case, it happens in two different situations on Google Cloud, Google Play for about $3,000 or a nice elite number and $5,000 bounties. So still there. I shouldn't ignore it all the time, but help me out here. Is there anything more exciting or interesting we can cover about something like XSS?
It's funny. I actually hadn't recognized that lead as one of the bounty payouts. That's cool. I think where this is, it's picking my words. Where this is interesting from the point of view of it's a large enterprise that we routinely think highly of their application security capabilities, but still something was able to sneak through, right? And so that, I think what was interesting about this is to see just that opening paragraph, a pair of vulns, and then that's somehow hitting just those two vulnerabilities is hitting. It seemed like to me multiple Google properties. So there's some amount of code reuse going. They've got some internal libraries, right? And at the same time, that's good and bad. This is the problem with having your centralized code bases and code reuse. Is like if something happens in one place, it's going to happen across multiple. But at the same time, when you fix it in one place, you go fix it across multiple, hopefully. So I thought it was interesting from that point of view. I thought it was interesting, as I said, low hanging fruit still falls off the trees owned by the big guys. So that's sort of a bit of a consolation prize for the smaller ones who are trying to fight with some of these things and get them working right. But yeah, beside that, it is another XSS. I mean, we haven't been seeing that many of them, or at least they're either low enough that they're just not getting on our radar. It's not that we're not talking about them on the podcast. But yeah, they fixed it quickly.
Yeah, congrats! Nice payout, and maybe one other small comment for me on this is, listeners, are there certain types of attack classes or types of attacks you'd like to hear us talk more of or focus on? Let us know, and we can talk more about cross-site scripting, or we can talk more about software and hardware vulnerabilities. I have an article here, John, from NCC, which I think breaks the record for the longest URL title that we've ever had. And I threw this in because I thought I thought this might perk your interest. So let you dive into it first.
Yeah, and I missed this one. This is a good find. Thank you. I need to go back and look at my sources and figure out why I'm not seeing these from NCC. Yeah, I hadn't. So this is a company called Nuki Smart Lock. They're on version 3.0, everybody. And I think I've probably said on the show before, I have a really tough time. I love the idea of startups working on improving the smart whatevers of your house. But the area that we've constantly seen over the last probably 3-4 years on here, Mike, is smart locks are very seldom as secure as they should be. And that's something that's on the front of your house. I always say, why don't I just go and I would never do this, excuse me. Why wouldn't someone just go and break a window and get in that way instead of worrying about the security of that front door lock? But at the same time, let's not make it easier. So Nuki, with their 3 features of smart, simple, and secure, ran into our friends over at NCC, who, as you said, came up with 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 different vulns in here. And I was trying to read through this before we went live. Well, they actually got so their blog platform they're using now actually tells you at the top, this is going to take you 21 minutes to read. So as soon as the show is over, folks get going. Let's see. I'm going to run through a few of these. Lots of TLS. There's obviously no SSL or TLS validation going on. And the recommendation there was sort of cute. Implement SSL TLS certificate validation for every function that uses network communication. Thanks. But, they're all over the place. There's some good code samples in here. They had one of these for a few weekends and they went to town on it. Some guys have had some fun with this one. Buffer overflow and HTTP parameters. Some screenshots of some debugging of that. Broken ACLs of the BLE protocol. So pretty much anything this thing's doing, if it's talking, it wouldn't surprise me if it went down far enough in this and found that there's a problem with the buttons on the device. I shouldn't be that snarky against them, but sorry, it's coming out. But the one that really caught my interest on here, CVE 2022-32503, JTAG exposed via test points. And they're giving this a CV SS 3.0 risk of a 7.6, which is pretty high. And for those that don't know, a JTAG interface is used for, it's one of the two or three common sort of interfaces you'll find on a circuit board for doing either low-level troubleshooting or reprogramming of the firmware on that, whatever that thing is, smart device or car or what have you. These things are everywhere. And they show a picture of it here of, that's a 7-pin, 1, 2, 3, 4. That doesn't look like JTAG. Usually JTAG is 4 pins, I thought, and now our listeners go correct me. But anyways, I don't understand how that's a vulnerability. I guess there's labels beside it. Are they like complaining that it's a labeled? So that one really sort of threw me a curveball. For we got a few folks at Security Weekly that are fond of doing hardware hacking. And it might be interesting for us to run this through some of our internal channels and go like, hey, would you consider that a vulnerability? I mean, it's usually one of the first steps if you're going to try and do hardware hacking on a device is figure out, is there a JTAG or some sort of hardware troubleshooting interface on there? And yeah, they're usually not labeled. So you have to go through the bus part or something which can actually take those pins and try to figure out which pin is which and try to figure out what's going on there. But to call that a vulnerability of almost a CVSS 8, that's sort of interesting. And I don't think I'd agree with that personally. But still, there's a lot of stuff going on here which is pretty meaty. For folks that are into hardware hacking, what are they doing here? Sorry, I didn't go through this whole thing before. There's so many of them. I'm just looking at another one. Another test points are exposed, and they're calling that a 6.4 CVSS. I mean,
my only guess there. I was going to say my only guess there is that because these are locks and you don't want someone like easily accessing the test points and popping it open, Mission Impossible style, as they're sitting in front of your at your front door with alligator clips. So maybe that's kind of the threat environment they're considering, and physical access is high. A bit of a shrug there, but just trying to help them out on that aspect.
Yeah, and come on, we have very high respect for NCC, so
we do.
This is unlike Nuki, but so I'll stop. But yeah, it's definitely, if you want to see what happens when you take a sort of a common. I mean, I'm trying to think of a positive thought on this. Right? It's so hard because I've talked to not this vendor, but I've talked to other vendors before doing smart locks. And it's the same story we always talk about on here. It's like, it's a young company. They've only got so much money. They've got an awesome idea. They think they've got a way to change the world. They're trying to get that out into people's hands, but they don't have the money to, go and hire us or NCC or someone else to actually do things right and try to get it secure. So what's that balance? I get it.
I agree, because part of that balance too is even that there's Stack Overflow in one of the JSON parsers. Just that's a dead simple, very classic type of problem to show up, but it's in sprintf, and all of the modern C compilers are going to give you warnings about shouldn't you maybe be using snprintf, which at least do some length checks on the buffer you're writing into. And so to me, my question there is, were they just suppressing warnings? That's a tool you have for free, giving you the feedback for free. That just shouldn't happen. And maybe that's one of those areas that turn on all the warnings in your college level comp sci classes, and that's part of the be aware of cybersecurity. We can start with there. I don't know, but that was the one that really stood out for me.
It would be interesting to see a sort of a last thought on here. And this is one of the things, again, which a lot of startups do, is I don't want to say outsource, but they outsource a lot of their both the software and hardware design. So it wouldn't surprise me if maybe this is like, a few Stanford grads who've got a good idea. They've gone and they've not hired people in another country, but they've found a company that has people, and they said, okay, we're building this lock. It needs to have Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, it needs to be able to be accessible for multiple people's phones, has to have iOS and Android support. List off a few more common things here. And by the way, we need, it has to look like this. This is what we want to look like. So we need to go and find a hardware company in China, probably, right, which is going to, they will do the whole engineering and design of what's going on inside that box. They'll go through a few design iterations and then say, that looks great, send it to manufacturing. And maybe that's what happens. So the core company isn't actually looking what's happening here, and someone else just saying, just get it good enough and get the money from these guys.
Just get it good enough. And I guess my last comment there is, NCC, all you need to do is run Doom on that thing, and then you would have gotten it onto John's radar. So just a pointer for the future. So let's move on to another article. This was about Office macros that were on again, off again, off again, but finally off by default. And honestly, my take was not so much about the Office macros themselves, other than this article has some good statistics just showing that the attackers don't have this attack vector available to them anymore. So they're going to switch techniques and go after some other attack vector, which is what we want to see in reducing an attack surface. But for me, I wanted to riff on the idea of, why don't we still have more secure defaults, and these hardening guides that we have in 20-page PDFs are instead the unhardening guides. And I need some help here on the marketing of this. Maybe it's a weakening guide, or it's a deconfiguration, or we're embrittling a particular application from its secure default. And that's the framing I'd love to get to in 5 to 10 years from now. But
we are enabling the success of junior developers. How about that? No, bad, maybe not. What's interesting about this to me is, so there's talking about stats, for the listeners who aren't reading here, we've seen a 1,600%, that's 1,600% increase in the last 10 months or so of using other tactics beside malicious Office macros. So it's pretty much, 10x. That's just really just validation of what they're saying. What was interesting to me about this is, think about how many things we have out there that are not going to get fixed in the next 3-4 years. CISA, I believe, came out last week and said that they believe that Log4j, ring a bell, we mentioned it again, but that's going to be endemic and around for countless years. SolarWinds was going to take a while to fix. Most of these things we see out there are taking a long time to fix. So the fact that people are staying up to date with Office versions, that's sort of what that sounds like to me. I don't know if that's, I might be making too big of a leap there, but that's sort of the way that translates to me, that they're able to turn something like this off, and within a relatively short period of time, they've managed to mitigate that.
Now, that's an interesting point, and it does bring in maybe another aspect of where can, maybe not responsibility is too strong a word, or where is the best leverage point for security for an ecosystem. Because as we talk about maturity of orgs, as well as small orgs versus large orgs, just installing an office update, and if it doesn't break the important financial workflows you have, but you're a small business, and if you get that hardening now from a secure default for free, that's probably a really good thing, because a lot of those small businesses probably, unfortunately, also don't have like a strong 2FA with FIDO keys, which is the way I'm setting up a segue into GitHub. And we did mention NPM. We've mentioned NPM a couple times, just like that other Java-based vulnerability that I'm trying to avoid mentioning for the rest of the year. Let's see how long I last. But this was something that it's sort of old news in enabling 2FA. But one thing that stood out to me from this particular article that I didn't appreciate the first time around was the quote, "Our initial design was created to be backwards compatible with NPM 6 and other clients, and the Yarn project could backport support for this in less than 10 lines of code." So to me, that was like, oh, right, we should be remembering what is the migration path? How can we, rather than just tell developers, go add 2FA, let's give them a migration path. Let's show them that it's actually easy to do. Meaning, here is the time to implement, or a mean time to repair, which is, I think, a bit in the spirit of what we were talking about with Manish. So that was the part of this I wanted to highlight as sort of that lesson learned. How could you adopt this principle to other security campaigns, other security efforts?
Yeah. So the first version of this article, which I saw, was the first time I saw coverage of this from another publication, used the title, and this is Bleeping Computer, used the title, GitHub introduces two-factor authentication and quality of life improvements for NPM. So I thought that, and this comes back to directly what you're saying, right? And I thought that sort of, that call out in the title, beside the fact that the headline got my attention and got me to click, it's not quite clickbait, but like I thought that was interesting. I'm watching with eagerness on how this whole GitHub Microsoft thing goes over the next few years. Not just like they're staying fairly separate, not just from a pure business point of view and things like that, but in particular this security thing, right? As I've said before, I think Microsoft has a lot of good security folks. GitHub obviously does too. How those guys dance and play together, I think it's going to be interesting. I didn't fully scan this version of the article, but my understanding is there was a pretty good amount of head scratching going on before they actually released this, right? This was thought through pretty well. How do we do something like this in a way which, I think you could say the NPM community, the JavaScript community, isn't really looking for a lot of security hoops to jump through. Bit of an understatement, right? But so now you realize that's your core customer, and this is a fairly big community. How do you introduce things out to them in a way which, sort of slowly cook the frog, to sort of go negative on that? But so I think that's what's interesting about this, Timmy. Like you said, it's been done in a way to allow both uptick in the users be fairly painless, but also for third parties which are they are leveraging that and getting into it. So I think that's pretty cool how they've done it. The takeaway again for our listeners is, it's for those who are working on a project which is large enough that other people want to consume what you're doing, whether it is something like this as a service or maybe even a library, is when you make a change. The more thought you can put into this, of how you make that simple and smooth, keeps people happy in using a product. And then I guess the other side of that, if you want to comment on it at all, is for communities like Go, where the understanding is it is left up to the consumer to stay up to date and deal with our breaks, which we do. That's the interesting sort of comparison between those two right there.
That's a good point. And especially to also talk about Microsoft, I think it's pretty much any software that existed back when MTV launched just about can run on a modern Microsoft. They've done pretty well with backwards compatibility, as opposed to what you were saying. We're going to break an ABI and force upgrade paths, which have their gives and takes. But maybe I want to think more optimistically that we're in a modern era of faster CI/CD, faster fix rates, that being able to stay up to date is more viable than painful. But speaking of viable and painful things, there's a pair of articles here. I grabbed one about data breach costs, but you also grabbed one I think is a nice pair with it about the time from vuln disclosure to exploits. So the time is shrinking, time is fleeting. And I can't sing all of the rest of the song, the time warp, because otherwise we'll get hit by some YouTube copyright bans. But while I hum that to myself, walk us through this article.
That's stuck in my head. Horrible person. Yeah. So I think I'm going to start with the one I found, just because I think these are both they've been brushed with the brush of marketing pretty well. But PanW, Palo Alto Networks Unit 42 is saying that's the length of time from publishing a vulnerability until compromise. Attackers are typically start scanning for vulnerabilities within 15 minutes of a CVE being announced. So cool. Is this something new to us? I don't know. I mean, I guess, yeah, sort of. What's the takeaway? I think for me, the core takeaway is there's a good number of, if you've got a system out there, which is, what's the phrase that they use? Critical infrastructure. If you can, and this is more from a first responder point of view, or the folks that are on that side of the fence, if you can possibly get on the critical infrastructure early announcement lists, or like if you can like somehow, watch those mailing lists, watch what's going on, the sooner you can figure out about that type of stuff so you can protect it, that's going to help you out significantly. From an AppSec point of view, I don't know. Part of me is wondering, this is about published CVEs. So, okay, that's cool. I think the nasty things we've seen over the last few years, and again, feel free to correct me on this, the nasty things we've seen over the last few years, I think have been out in the wild well before a CVE was published for it. So, okay. So that's that side of the coin. And then we've got the data breach numbers. The headline really was a head scratcher for me. Data breach costs record 4.3 million with firms. What? I mean, maybe that reads smoother to other people. That could just be me and my dyslexia. But 4.3 million doesn't sound like a record. That's like, chump change when it comes to data breaches. But I think they're talking about average. They talk about in the first paragraph. But that sounds low. And maybe this is bringing me back down to earth and saying that the numbers aren't quite as bad as I would expect them to be.
Yeah, and that's where I think that there's an aspect too of, speaking of the exploitability, lots of times attackers don't even necessarily need to go scanning for the vulns. They may already know through Shodan or through prior scanning, prior intelligence gathering, we know that this system is running this version of software and we know it's going to be vulnerable. We don't even have to scan for it. We can just directly exploit. So I'm clearly talking about more advanced in terms of attackers there, but just sophisticated attackers that are targeting a particular infrastructure, a particular org, holding on to that information. This, admittedly, I agree. It took me 3 or 4 times to figure out, this headline's just talking what this headline's talking about. But for me, this headline about data breach costs was bringing in an aspect of how much do we talk about the cost of a breach, or what's this going to cost us money-wise in terms of threat modeling? Because we've gone on a couple times about threat modeling, and there's 2 aspects here. Would we talk about, here's a vulnerability, we're going to be exploited within 15 minutes, therefore we need to be able to have our 90-second scan and what's that, a 13-minute patch so we can get it out before we get exploited, or we need to spend 4.2 million on our security tooling so we can stay just below the average of a 4.3 million loss from a data breach. I'm obviously being a little bit facetious here, but honestly, in my threat modeling, I rarely use the attacker time to exploit. I sometimes talk about financial costs just to try to get orders of magnitude. Is this a 1 million, 10 million, 100 million type of bucket? But I don't go further than that. So I don't know, in your experience, John, or if you have a different preference when you talk about threat models, look at apps.
No, I totally agree with you on that. And there's a slight business side to that too, right? Is if you're, so there's the pure threat modeling side of that, with the app team of like, okay, what's the scale of this? But then there's, okay, now we've got some sort of idea of the scale of things. The security guy turned around and goes from the dev team and talks to the business team and goes, how much are we going to spend to protect against this? I was going to make a joke there that, from Manish on the last segment. So he now knows that his product has to cost less than $4 million so that people will, right? So there's someone's doing that calculation out there. If you're a vendor, you're not going to be successful. But that's it's there's always a cost people are willing to pay, and then there's a amount which we're willing to invest. So when I say invest, I'm talking about the application security side, the product improvement side of things, right? Doing the threat model and stuff like you're talking about. But there's also maybe our dev team can't move fast enough, or Mike's not here, or Mike's twin clone didn't quite work as we expected it to, so we only have one mic. But for whatever reason, we need to go and throw the money in a different direction. So let's go and buy a product and put it in front, or in our CI process, whatever else. But so that's interesting to me. There was something in here I had highlighted that was talking about part of this number is going down because ransomware is getting responded to better. And then that sort of, it throws it out of the AppSec field for me. But that's where a lot of security's been for the last, 3 to 5 years is frantically trying to figure out how to deal with ransomware, which quite honestly isn't really on my radar. And I think this is interesting for us to think about from AppSec point of view, which why I mentioned it. Mm-hmm. The ransomware usually happens the ability to do a ransomware attack exists because of AppSec issues, whether it's at the OS level or the application or whatever have you in between. But I consider my own sort of world like secured enough that and backed up enough that you're I hate saying this type of stuff out loud, but you're probably not going to pop me. And if you do, there's nothing incriminating against me that you're going to be able to, ransom me for. So personally, it's not that big a thing. In my company, I keep things done pretty well. So again, not to worry about there. There's always the weakest link, whether that's a developer or someone else. So it's interesting from that point of view to sort of think through, we focus a lot on AppSec, but how does the larger sort of sphere of things, play with us?
Yeah, and I think the one final thing I'd add on that particular topic is tying together the Microsoft article, the Office one. That was talking about attack vectors and phishing, and with macros being a primary vector. And there's a cost there in the sense that I will harp once again on FIDO keys, in the sense that FIDO keys are very essentially unphishable. And I'm sure we can get some corrections coming in on those statements like that. But if we talk about costs, roughly say $50 to make the math easy, maybe $100 because you have to manage it as well. There's a little bit of overhead. $100 for a FIDO key times the number of employees you have. If that comes out to less than 4 million, that's probably a good investment, because that's going to reduce a significant attack surface of how how attackers are going to come in. And then, of course, there's a backlog of ASW to listen to figure out how to harden all the rest of your cloud environment and applications. But that's what I'd add. Yeah, exactly. But we've been doing a lot of thinking so far this episode, John, and I think it's time to also then highlight some articles from Phil Venables, who does perhaps more insightful and more in-depth thinking that we do. At least I'll say that about myself. But what was really neat about this is that it's he did a 3-year review where he's talking about both the readers' top 5, meaning of the posts, what were the most viewed, and his personal favorites. And what was really interesting to me is one of the most the most read articles, which we'll get to in a second, Cybersecurity and the Curse of Binary Thinking, had an order of magnitude more views than his personal favorite, the one that he liked to talk about, or that he particularly enjoyed, which was the uncanny valley of security. And there's a couple things here. One, both articles I think are worth diving into, so hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for that. But I liked looking at this just from perspective of what's the disconnect or the difference between what a reader, what a listener really gloms onto and what we might think is interesting. So this is a call out to listeners. Give us feedback. Let us know what you'd like to hear more of. But also maybe we can look back at one of our episodes from a year ago or 2 years ago and highlight one of the articles or one of the statements we made and see has our opinion changed or what's been different a year later. So that a couple areas where my head went to. And I'm not sure if, John, you got something broad like that, or if you want to dive in one of these articles first.
I was looking through them, sort of figuring out where was, my favorite compared to both what he thought and what the listeners thought or the readers thought. I thought it was interesting. They was just going purely off views. I mean, I guess that makes sense. And that the Curse of Binary Thinking, that really got, for those playing along at home, 21,000 views versus Phil's number one, which you just mentioned, Uncanny Valley, had what, 2,500? Is that like 1/10? I think you just said 1/10. Yeah. My favorite actually was the 10 fundamental but really hard security metrics. And I think it was interesting to see that come across on both lists. It's from the point of view of, we don't talk about often on this show, but it is pretty difficult. Like, how do you, last half we were talking about developers looking at mean time to resolution versus, the security guys thinking more about mean time to mitigation of security thing. But what are decent metrics we should be thinking about? And I don't know if I fully agreed with his list, but I thought it was cool to see, someone of this stature, what does it look at like from them? And then again, have a think about it. So I think that was cool. Sorry, I just giggled as I went by his number 4, time to reboot the company. Hopefully none of our listeners have to deal with that anytime soon. But yeah, it's a good list of metrics they're not too, I'll say calculus heavy, right? They're not like really sort of like, we need a ton of data and then we're going to go and do a bunch of really great analytics on it. They're pretty sort of common things, I think, but they still, from a CISO point of view or, a security leader point of view, is like, what's going on here with this program? What is the blast radius if we have a vulnerability? The Java vulnerability which shall not be named, if that is in our application, what is the blast radius? Does it go affect a portion of the application or the whole thing? And again, tie this back with sort of how we were talking in the last half hour with if any given tool in your CI process manages to find a vulnerability, which is actually what's the phrase we were talking about? Exploitable vulnerability. Okay, well, is that, again, going to hit in one particular place? Do we need to spend a ton of money to like re-architect and fix this one thing or scan or mitigate how we do it? Or is it something that like it's going to be a cheap fix, but it's going to be touching a lot of stuff? So I think looking at this article, which isn't purely, or looking at this blog post, which isn't purely AppSec focused, and putting that AppSec hat on, I think is an interesting process. And I'll shut up.
No, I think with that particular metrics one that you highlighted, they're not absolute numbers either. They're more about the business practices. What can we do? And essentially, they're software practices. They're nothing about. I have to go back and do my Control F and see, does it even mention vulns anywhere? Is it even talking about the number of vulns we have and something like that? For me, the article, I did like the Curse of Binary Thinking because it pokes to a bunch of topics that engenders more nuanced conversations rather than just a quick snarky comment and we move on. Things like complexity is the enemy of security, which is one of my favorite articles that he's written more about as well. And is just one of those themes of, we as InfoSec have either a bunch of metaphors that we like to use. I will say that we get overused and start to dilute what the underlying message actually is of what we're talking about, or we're repeating just phrases or concepts that aren't necessarily accurate. I know one thing, just kind of speak to this really quickly. One of our peers within the Security Weekly, Adrian Sanabria, he has been looking at some myths within cybersecurity. And that's an area that we'll have to have him come on the show, maybe talk about some of the myths within AppSec. But I think that fits into this spirit of binary thinking and how can we be smarter or more effective as we discuss cybersecurity topics. Mm-hmm. So that was a little bit my soapboxy take on that.
To bring it right back to where you started on this, it's something, for listeners, we frequently ask, like, hey, give us feedback, what do you want to hear more of, or what do you not like, and we do get that and appreciate it, mostly. But it's really interesting to think about from any of us, whether it's us on a podcast with a good number of listeners, or, you and your team of 5 people out there, is the stuff that you're talking about. If you're ranting about, I don't know, if we talk about cross-site scripting, if you were the security guy at your company, you're ranting about cross-site scripting, and all your developers are like, oh my God, he's on this soapbox again. What's interesting to them, right? And I think that's one of the core things about this article, Mike, as you were saying at the beginning, is if they're all going out at lunchtime and talking about, I don't know, some movie that just came out. I haven't watched a movie in a theater in like so long, but let's find a better example. Cricket matches, Formula One. Don't talk to me about Ferrari, but pick whatever that thing is. Like, what did you guys guys and gals and whoever else, what did they think about when they go out to lunch or have like the Friday Zoom conversations? Okay, is that anywhere close to what you're thinking about? If not, maybe how can you sort of bring yourself back in line with those guys, or pull them towards you, or what's that happy dance? So I think from that point of view, it's interesting to look at this and see what people outside your own little sphere are thinking about.
I think that's a great way to end it. I don't think I can top that or add anything better than you just said it, John. So I'm going to say thank you for helping us close this out. Another episode. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes, and speaking of MTV, check out the video for Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.